Welcome to the Ridgecrest podcast. This is where we take time each week for a deeper look into the previous Sunday's sermon. My name is Matt. I'm the executive and discipleship pastor here at Ridgecrest, and with me is our senior pastor, Michael Estes.
How's it going?
Going pretty well. It was, good weekend. Long, busy weekend, but
Right.
I know some state fans who are probably pretty pumped.
Yeah, it was. I don't even. There's a guy that I follow on Twitter. I'm having a hard time kind of forming thoughts this morning, but there's a guy I follow on Twitter that repeatedly has called us the weirdest team in college football.
Yeah.
And he is so right.
100%.
We can look awesome one minute and really terrible the next, and all of a sudden we find ourselves at the end of a top 20 win on the road, biggest comeback in school history. I was actually at Lorelai's swim meet in Laurel, and I had terrible reception in there, so I couldn't watch the game while she was swimming and stuff like that in between her actual swims. And so I was kind of following on Gamecast, and all of a sudden I look up and we're a touchdown behind, and then we block a kick, and then we score within 2 minutes, and I was like, we're gonna win the game. It was unbelievable.
Yeah.
Couldn't believe it.
Yeah, I watched the whole game, and I know there were a lot of people who turned it off, but I hung in there for you guys, and I'm glad I did, because, and of course, they said this on the announcing guys. Apparently, Leach had told one of them this, and when they said it, I completely agreed. His comment was, "They can't stop us. We just have to execute.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the position we need to be to make plays. Get down the field. We just have to catch the ball, make the throw. And I agree, because every play, there were guys wide open, and that sort of thing. It's I can see that. And sure enough, about 6 minutes to go in the second quarter, they started executing. And from then on, Auburn, like I said, they did not have anything for you.
I'm convinced. Say what you will about Mike Leach. I'm convinced that the dude is a genius. He sees things that nobody else can see, because I'm watching parts of the beginning of that game, and I'm like, defensively, we cannot stop them. And offensively, I didn't get to see many of our first offensive possessions, but he obviously saw something where he was like, we're good.
Yeah.
I know we're down 25, but as soon as it clicks, they're not going to stop us.
Yeah.
And because he said that to our quarterback, Will Rogers, and it's just all of a sudden it started to happen, and boom, 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 you're right back in the game, and then you're ahead, and then you're going ahead by double digits, and it was a 40-point swing. Yeah. That's unbelievable. Never seen anything like that in college football.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was wild. And Lane Kiffin, he picked you guys.
I know.
He was on. I thought it was hilarious because everyone else picked Auburn, and of course Ole Miss, all the fans, because it was
they moved.
They're all booing him.
Booing your own coach. Okay, so this brings me to the question that I was going to ask. I saw this one on Twitter the other day, and I was like, that's a good question. What's the best sporting events to take a nap to?
Take a nap to?
Yes.
I guess you're watching it on TV?
Yeah. You're not the event. That would make it hard. So you're sitting there on an afternoon, a lazy afternoon, you got an opportunity to take a nap, and you're watching a sporting event. What you flipping on to take the nap?
Well, I think there's two obvious choices.
Okay.
I don't know there's much more than this. I think NASCAR and golf.
I would agree. I have Steven says NASCAR. Yeah. I have massive quantities of anecdotal evidence for this, because my dad, who is a NASCAR, I guess a fan still. I don't know if he's still a fan. I hadn't talked to him in a while, but we used to go to Talladega and stuff like that when I was younger. Anyways, on Sunday afternoons, he would get in his recliner, turn on the NASCAR race, 20 laps in, fall asleep, wake up for the last 10. Yeah. And he'd watch the race that way. Yeah. And, obviously it worked.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the best way to watch it. You see the start.
A lot of left-hand turns.
Get you a good nap in, wake up, see the finish. That sounds, perfect. Sounds to me like he's got it figured out.
Yeah. Yeah. So NASCAR or golf for you, I agree about golf. I've taken good naps to golf. I like soccer, but it is a great sport to nap to. Because it's kind of quiet. There's not a whole lot of excitement that happens throughout the course of the game. Yeah. And so it's not hard to. When I was in college at Mississippi State, I would regularly turn on ESPN. There'd be a match on in the afternoon, and that would be my napping sport.
Yeah.
So
that's good.
So we were doing this for people who are tired today, kind of weary. And if you're weary and tired,
Turn on the podcast. Have you get a nap.
that's what we're here for. We try to meet needs in all kinds of ways.
That's right.
I have a talent for putting kids to sleep in our services. 2 weeks in a row,
Yeah.
I had people with babies in there or young children.
Yeah.
And I get to the end of the service, and when I started to preach, they went to sleep. I am apparently the baby whisperer.
There you go. Check it out.
So if you're struggling with getting your kid to sleep some, and you need a nap too, I'm okay with that. Like, I'd rather you listen to the sermon, but I can also understand as a young parent what that was like to be that tired. And so if you get your kid to sleep, you go to sleep. It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah.
We'll get you a blanket. We'll
Yeah.
we'll take care of your needs. That's
Yeah.
what we're here for.
That's right. I don't really know how to segue from that.
Yeah.
Now all I can think about is
Taking a nap?
Taking a nap.
When's the last time you took a nap?
A long time.
Yeah, it's been a while for me too.
Yeah.
I don't take naps.
I'm not a napper because it ruins my whole sleep schedule. If I take a nap, even if it's a short nap, I end up being up late, and then the next 3 days I feel like I'm playing catch up.
That's right.
So-
I am jealous of serial nappers. People who can do it on a regular daily basis, I am jealous of those people because I think there's something there to it. Like this idea that I can siesta or Sabbath in the middle of a day just
Yeah.
for like an hour, maybe less, but like just an hour, just boom, gone. Like
Yeah.
taking a nap. God can take care of the rest of it. I can rest in that. I probably should adopt that in some way, shape, or form, but
Yeah, that'd be nice. And like I said, if I could figure out a way to not mess up my next night's sleep, then
right, yeah.
I would be all about it. But yeah, we need to figure out how to do that. So
All right.
now that we're all tired and thinking about how nice
Get a
nap
cup of
would
coffee.
be, yeah, get
You'll
a
be
cup of
fine.
coffee.
You'll be all right.
I've got mine, so we're ready to roll. Continue work through Acts, and I will say, I've heard a lot of really great things that God's been doing in the life of people. We heard some of those at the RFU, and some things like that. And so it's been neat to see God working through this, and Acts. Again, it's turning the world upside down and kind of gives us a glimpse of what this group of people who had not near the resources we have and doing that. And so I think it should move us, in that direction, figure out how we can do that in our own culture and community. So to get started, a main point that we looked at this week in Acts 15 was this, kind of, I guess really one of your first interactions as far as internal conflict. As we talked about persecution. We've talked about some things as far as going on outside the church, but here we see some issues going on inside the church, and looking at how that is addressed and some of the issues that were at hand. And main part of that was kind of you see this kind of first adoption of, as you said, like Jesus plus theology, where you're taking Jesus, or you're taking the gospel, and you're saying, well, yeah, that's good, but you also need this, or you also need to do this. In this particular passage, they were talking about circumcision,
Right.
And kind of walking through that. So the question I have is, what's the difference between Jesus plus theology and expectations of life change? And and what I mean by that is, I think we slip into this Jesus plus theology a lot more often than we think, and because it's easy, for us to kind of slip into this. And one comment I'll say, well, I've said it, I've heard others say it. Well, how can this person do this and be a Christian?
Right.
How can they believe this and be a Christian? Or how can they do whatever and still be a Christian? And what we're doing there is we're kind of attaching that and saying, well, to be a Christian, they need to adhere to this, or this.
Yeah.
And so we're really quickly sliding into this Jesus plus theology. So what's the difference? How do you manage that? How do you figure out what that looks like as far as separating yourself from having this Jesus plus theology, but also expecting life change, expecting transformation from the gospel?
Yeah, so the way I kind of think through this particular issue is Jesus plus theology says life change is what saves you. And it ultimately makes salvation a man-based thing. So like there is a sense in which we still want to control our salvation. We want to have a say in our salvation. And so we add something on to grace alone, right? And then Jesus alone theology basically says salvation, life change occurs because of salvation. So it's not that this is what leads to my salvation, but this is what leads from my salvation. This is what happens as a result of my salvation. Now, when you get into issues of, okay, what happens when a believer falls into sin? Well, we see lots of evidence of this in Paul's letters. The Corinthian church, I mentioned them in the first service, I didn't mention them in the second service, was a disaster. It was a dumpster fire, for lack of a better term. I love that terminology because it's so, it illustrates things in so many ways. If something is not going well, a dumpster fire, because it stinks, it's nasty, it's, and it's hard to put out. In the same way that the Corinthian church was that way. Paul writes 2 letters to them. They have huge issues in both the 2 letters. In one particular case, you have a man that is fallen into a sexually immoral relationship with his mother-in-law. And what's interesting about that is at the beginning of the letter, he calls them saints. They're believers.
Yeah.
He's not denying the fact that they're believers, but he's like, you need to check yourself. Like, you're making me wonder whether or not you actually believe the gospel. And it's not because he says this is what saves you. He's saying, if you really believe this is what saves you, you're not going to keep trying to justify yourself in other ways. And I was reading a really good chapter on this yesterday in Dana Ortland's Deeper, the book Deeper. It's all about sanctification. And in there, he talked about the fact that like justification is so important to us if we understand, and just to make sure my terminology is clear, justification is our legal standing before God. God has justified us through Jesus Christ. He has made us righteous through Jesus Christ. We have right standing in a court of law. The verdict is acquittal. He said, you're not guilty. Okay. The reason that matters so much to us is because so much of our idolatry is really built on trying to justify ourselves, justify our existence, our life, what makes us important, what makes us valuable. So the reason that, I don't know, a middle-aged man who's been in a marriage for 15 years runs off into adultery is not just because he just, decides to, behave badly one day. What he's trying to do is justify himself. He's trying to make himself feel like he matters.
Yeah.
That he has right standing before people, right? And so you can do that by running off into the arms of another woman who decides that she likes you, right? And we do this in all kinds of ways. We steal. Ultimately, when we steal, it's a sense in which we have made that object an idol to the point that we're willing to compromise our ultimate belief that God is able to care for us. And so all of that, like when we start to wonder about, okay, can someone be a Christian and do X, Y, Z? The answer is yes, they can do X, Y, Z. There should be expectations on our part that because they've been saved, because they've understood grace, they're not going to want to do X, Y, Z anymore.
Yeah.
And so there's a struggle with sin and in our sin nature that we continue to fight. But it's a struggle that we can grow in. Like, that's the thing that I think is so hard for us, is that when we battle against sin and those sorts of things, ultimately it's not about like trying to come up with a formulaic way of battling sin and stuff like that. It is a return to the gospel every single time. Jesus has said, I love you. You are in right standing with God. It's not your works, it's my works. I'm going to continue to intercede for you. You don't have to be afraid anymore. You don't have to try to justify yourself anymore. So you can walk in this newness of life, is the way Paul puts it in Romans 6. And so, with all that being said, like, we do have to be careful not to slip off into a Jesus plus theology. So, yes, we have expectations for believers, but ultimately, we still see them as believers until they've given us really good reason not to believe that anymore.
Sure.
Right? If we have a believer that just cannot, or a person that cannot walk away from habitual sin, after a certain amount of time, I don't know what that time frame is, but maybe that's the wrong way to put it. But ultimately, like, we should see at some point a decision to walk away from sin, a decision to, to begin to live in accordance with the calling, that we've been called to. And so, but it's It's a fine line. We've debated it for years and years and years in
Yeah.
the church. What's the relationship between faith and works? It's really what we're talking about.
Right.
I believe Paul and James are saying the same thing. Paul's like, grace alone saves us. James is like, we display our faith through our works. And so we need to see those two as not like opposites completely, but two sides of the same coin. We get grace, and because we get grace, works come.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is we begin to live out of that grace.
Yeah. And I think, one way I always try to look at it, I look at, of course, now you're starting to kind of get into, spiritual growth and, discipleship and things like that, and it's easy to kind of compare that to physical development of a child.
Yeah.
Whenever an infant, when they're hungry, they cry. When, they, have any needs, they cry. Now if a child is 8, 9 years old and they're not communicating and they're not, showing that they can now communicate in different ways, there's going to be some type of developmental issue. Same thing spiritually. If someone looks like a spiritual infant, where there's, spiritual infant is oftentimes going to look like someone who's unchurched,
Right.
But if they look like that 10 years down the road, then there might be some other issues. Was there really transformation of the gospel that took place? Was there just not anybody there to disciple? All those types of things, and you can kind of work through that. And again, it is important for us to have that expectation, and and us be intentional in pouring into each other and helping us move towards those expectations. Because again, if someone has expectations for me as a Christian, if I'm a brand new Christian, someone has these expectations, you shouldn't do this, 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 or this, or this, or you should do this, 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 and this, and no one teaches that to me, then I'm not going to know those expectations. I'm going to sit and, hopefully I'm going to read the Bible, and the Holy Spirit will still work on me and convict me in some areas, but there's still that necessary part where we can pour into each other.
Well, and that gets back to, things that we've talked about a bunch, like the fact that the Christian life is not a very individualistic one. It is very much a communal life. And we need other people to speak into our lives, to pour into our lives, to keep us accountable, to help us grow. And so we're not intended to do this in an isolated, individualistic way. It's just not the way that the scriptures lay it out for us. All of Israel's history was communal. All of the church's history is communal. None of this stuff is happening in a vacuum. Yeah. And so we shouldn't look at Christian growth as this thing that we just kind of we get saved and then we figure it out ourselves.
Right.
What we have is a moment of conversion. Our life has changed, and then from that point on, we grow with other believers. We enter into relationship with other believers, and they help us, to become what we're supposed to be.
Yeah. And so along those lines, kind of looking at that relationship between believers, as I mentioned, this passage that we read, this was internal conflicts and things that were going on inside the church, and they were taking a stance on some biblical truth and what they understood as far as being saved by grace and those types of things. So the question is how does taking a stance on truth differ between issues inside the church and those outside the church?
Yeah. So we should expect believers to uphold and adhere to truth. They know it, right? Now, there may be some gaps in knowledge, but ultimately they know truth. And so while, on the other hand, we need to communicate our beliefs unashamedly, but we need to communicate that to outsiders. So we shouldn't expect outsiders to know truth. And so there's a knowledge gap between the two. That's the first step there. And so, when we get into issues of truth within the church, I think we can be more frank and open with one another. Really, to the point of open and very honest disagreement with one another. And so if we're talking about a theological issue like we saw in Acts chapter 15, where a group of people are saying, listen, circumcision is necessary to be saved, Paul and Barnabas have every right to say, no, that is not the truth. And we need to fight about this.
Yeah.
Whereas, if outsiders came in and challenged us on the issue of abortion or euthanasia or whatever, you just pick your issue. There's a bunch of them that we could go to. There's going to have to be a time where we communicate truth to them, and with the expectation that they don't really understand truth. And that's not an arrogance thing. That is simply like that the way Paul puts it in 2 Corinthians 3 and 4 is that the God of this world has veiled their eyes. They can't see the truth unless it's revealed to them. And so there's a sense in which we have truth and we need to share that with people outside of the church. But at a deeper level, and this is something that we kind of started to talk about with the last question, when we're dealing with issues of truth within the church or issues of sanctification within the church, or however you want to talk about this, there is a level of discipline that happens and discipleship that happens within the church. And so, like, again, we need to go back to we're a community of believers that are accountable to one another, and so we need to hold each other accountable on issues of truth. So if we know somebody's wandering off into false beliefs and stuff like that, it's our job to correct them. Paul does it. Galatians is a good example. I mean, Galatians is really about the issue that we're talking about in Acts 15. It's all about the fact that there's a group of people that are saying, hey, you need to be circumcised, you need to keep the law of Moses. And Paul's like, that's a false gospel. You don't need to believe that. And you need to correct them when they try to tell you that's the gospel. And you need to tell them the gospel is the one that was delivered to us through Paul, who actually got the gospel from Jesus himself. There's a sense in which we've got to hold each other accountable. And then when there's an unwillingness when truth is shared, like we see in Acts 15, where Peter gets up and speaks, James gets up and speaks, and at that point the issue's dead. Like, they agree, everybody's like, all right, let's go and do this thing that James suggested. Let's write a letter to the Gentiles and tell them this is what we've come to, this is what the truth is. There was no more debate.
Yeah.
And it's when there's this stiff-necked desire to continue to debate, continue to disagree, just for the sake of, I want to stir trouble up. That's where discipline has to come in.
Yeah.
And for hundreds of years now, church discipline has not been a real thing in the West and church in America. And so I've very rarely seen instances of discipline actually being carried out. I may have shared on the podcast before. I can't remember if I did or not. I know I've shared the story before. I was a part of a church in North Carolina that actually exercised church discipline on a church member. He was in an adulterous relationship. He had been confronted by a friend within the church that knew this was going on, and told him, hey, you need to return to your family. You need to put this adulterous relationship aside. He said that he would. He didn't. And then at that point, the deacon body it was deacon and a group of lay people within the church that got together, people who knew him, and went to him and said, look, we know this is going on. We have evidence that it's going on. You need to stop. Like, you need to go back to your wife. You need to go back to your family. And he refused. And at that point, the pastor got up when we were taking the Lord's Supper one evening and said that this church member was no longer allowed to take the Lord's Supper with us until he is restored to his family. And again, it wasn't like we're trying to cast you out of the church. We never want to see you again. It was an attempt to restore him.
Yeah.
And, I don't know that he ever was restored, but it was an issue where there was truth that was involved. We are, as believers, are called to be faithful to our spouses, and he refused to do that, and so there was discipline that had to take place. We'd never do that with an outsider. Why would we expect an outsider to walk faithfully with their spouse? I mean,
Yeah.
they can if they choose to,
Right.
but they have no moral law sitting over them, holding them accountable in that way, in the same
Yeah.
way that we do. Right?
Yeah.
And so, that's a way that conversation looks different between somebody who's inside and somebody who's outside the church.
Yeah. And I always come back to the most important issue that needs to be shared with those outside the church is the gospel.
Yeah.
And if we can get so tangled up in all the other issues that we as followers of Christ do hold dear and do hold as, great importance. But as you mentioned, if they don't know the gospel, nothing else is going to make sense, and nothing else is going to do that. So we've got to make that a priority, so that way that does invite us into a different kind of relationship of accountability and discipline and all those types of things. So with this, we see this kind of debate that takes place here. The question I have now is along those lines. When you look around our community, here in Madison, Mississippi, you look across the state, across the country. or really you can branch out to across the world. You've got a multitude, of churches, denominations. Here I don't I don't know exactly how many are here in our local association just of Southern Baptist churches, but where I was in East Tennessee, there were 107 in kind of our local area. There's not that many here in our association, but you had 107 that were Baptist churches. Not to mention you also have all your Presbyterian churches, Methodist churches, Catholic, all these different churches. The question I have, and it's a little bit of a reaching question because I don't know that you can really know the answer, without making some assumptions. But the question is the reason we have this multitude of churches and multitude of denominations, are those a result of a mishandling of internal conflict, or do you think these are necessary, so that the local church can have unity? Whether it be, I have some disagreement here. It may be secondary issues, but I'm going to go plant a church over here. That way it can be in line with my secondary issues and we as one local body can be unified, or is it, those issues should be better handled inside the church?
It's a big question. One that for a long time has bothered me. It bothers me that within our little circle of influence, you can drive right down the street and we're within a mile of probably 4 other churches, and there's some denominational differences in those 4 churches, but there's also we're not far from some other Baptist churches. There is a sense in which, like, back in the day, before we had motor vehicles and that sort of thing, it made sense to have multiple churches in different places because you can only walk so far to get to church, right? We also need to think about the fact that back in the day they met once a month in some cases, and yet they still called themselves a church. Anyways, that's a whole separate issue about church meeting times and those sort of things. But in our day, we don't have the same issue of the location of the church is or where we are determines where our church needs to be. It doesn't necessarily matter as much. I do think there's a lot of health in being a part of a church that is in your community. It's like it's in your within a very close driving distance of where you live and those sort of things, because it ministered to a very specific group of people. I would argue that the vast majority. That's probably not fair. A majority of churches that are of the same denomination, are in the same area, are a result of the fact that we just don't handle conflict very well. We have personal preferences, and I mean that's evidenced by the fact that there's First Baptist, Second Baptist, whatever. You have that happen all over the place.
Yeah.
You have churches that split and go right across the street from one another, and then they stop being co-laborers and they become competitors with each other. It troubles me that we see other churches as our competitors. That is very much a Western consumeristic mindset.
Yeah.
That is not the mindset of the New Testament. But Paul, Peter, James, they all saw the church as functioning together. Yes, you would have just, diverse bodies, but those diverse bodies could come together and serve one another and co-labor together. And we just bad at that. We're really, really bad at that. And I think that in a lot of cases, the disunity that is displayed by all of the different churches in our area, all of the different denominations, is an impediment to the growth of the kingdom and is an impediment to unity overall. Think about how rarely we interact with the Presbyterian church that's down the street, the Methodist church that's right next door. I don't think we're at odds with one another.
Right.
But we just don't communicate with each other because we already assume that we're not going to be able to communicate with each other because we have different secondary beliefs. We all believe that Jesus is Savior. We all believe that, I would assume that we're all Trinitarian.
Yeah.
And that the local church is an important thing. We differ on things like baptism, the Lord's Supper maybe church polity, the way we govern our churches. and yet we decided that we can't work together. And so the Methodists, they minister to whoever's at their church. We minister to whoever's at our church. The Presbyterians minister to whoever is at their church. Yet we probably have a lot of very core beliefs that we would agree on. And it's just an impediment to what we could do. Think about if we combine the resources of all the churches that are close to us. I'm not saying we have to do it here, but like wherever.
Yeah.
You combine all those resources and think about the number of lives that can be impacted in that. The other issue that we need to think about too, and when we think about the early church, is most of these churches were in houses.
Mm-hmm.
And so like when Paul writes a letter to the Galatians or the Ephesians or the Colossians, he's not writing to First Baptist Church of Colossae.
Yeah.
He is writing to a network of house churches that would then communicate the letter to one another. They would share that letter.
Right.
It would circulate in that area, and they would all read the same letter, and they would still work together. And so there's a lot that we lose in the way we have split up and divided things. I mean, the Reformation's great for a lot of things, but it was terrible for church unity. The fact that I can, one of the core beliefs of the Reformation, sola scriptura, Scripture alone can help me understand, what I need to know. What that did unintentionally, I think, it was along with a bunch of historical movements, is it created a very individualistic mindset when it came to church. And so, if I don't like the way Church A does worship and the interior of their sanctuary, I really like Church B better. I'm just going to go to Church B because I like their sanctuary and their worship better. Has nothing to do with the fact that like they're teaching some sort of untruth or whatever. They may be theologically pure, morally in good standing, and you're just like, I prefer something a little bit different, so I leave. That's not healthy for unity at all.
Yeah.
Church hopping is not healthy for unity. I mean, like there's a lot that you could look at and be like,
Right.
A buffet-style Christianity is not a healthy way to encourage unity, the unity of the body.
Yeah. Yeah, and the whole point of the local church and community is to display that unity, to those in our culture, and so they can see that we look different. I can't remember, was this?
I talked about the last two Sundays that when a diverse group of people display unity, we display God.
Yes.
Because we have a God that is three in one.
Yeah.
Diverse yet unified.
That's right. And right now, I would argue that, churches don't look different than what culture or community is.
The vast majority of our churches are very monolithic. And what I mean by that is they all look the same, sound the same. I don't mean every church looks the same. The people within the church in most cases, like the groups within the church. We've been listening to a podcast that talks about this idea of the mega church. It was in an early episode, and he talked about like one of the founding principles of some mega churches was we need to find a homogeneous group of people, and we're gonna reach that people. Yeah, and it had nothing to do with like the display of the diversity of humankind and how the gospel reaches each of us. Yeah, it just was like, what can we do to market ourselves to a particular group of people and get a bunch of those people? Yeah, that's that. I mean, I'm not trying to shoot shots at Rick Warren, but that's the whole point of Saddlebrook. They had a Saddleback. Yeah, Saddleback. They had basically a picture of this guy that they were like, this is the guy we're trying to reach. Yeah. And
Saddleback Sam.
Yep, that's him. It's still out there. You can Google it. And that's what they were going for. Yeah. And that's how that church started and exploded in growth.
That's right.
Partially because it's a lot more palatable to walk into a church where everybody looks like you.
And it's a lot easier to plan and create events and create worship styles and all those types of things based on this one group of people that we know this is what they like, and and we're gonna attract them in. And again, there are elements of that I get. I mean, whenever we talk about going into third world countries or planting churches in remote villages and things like that, you're not going to bring an Americanized version of the church there.
Can't.
You're going to go and minister to that culture. So I get the I guess the foundation of probably where it started.
Mm-hmm.
But the danger you run into is now you're completely getting away from this diversity that really the gospel is intended to create. And it's different whenever you're going into a cultural community like in a village in Africa, as compared to into a culture in America where we live in a diverse culture.
Yeah, we
it's
by
different.
nature have a diverse culture, whereas like if you walk into, I don't know, Eastern European city, everybody is going to look the same. Everybody's going to speak the same language, be
That's right.
Basically homogeneous in their makeup, and so we shouldn't be surprised when that's the case. But if we live in a diverse area, and we do, I mean,
Yeah.
you look at the cultural makeup of our particular area, we live in a place where there's a lot of jobs, and because there's a lot of jobs, there are lots of different types of people that are here, and our churches in the area should reflect that.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they don't.
That's right.
It doesn't mean they always don't. There are some churches that I know of in our area that are very diverse, and they have preached that for years as a part of their DNA.
Sure.
So,
and I do think that, there's a lot more to dissect there and figuring out how to do that,
Mm-hmm.
and figure out, because again, with diversity, you still have different cultures and different backgrounds, and you still want to bring value to those, and
Yes.
And that sort of thing. And so figuring out, well, how do you have worship together and it be diverse, where it's not just my preferences but their preferences, and how do I overcome, well, I don't necessarily like this piece, but my preference would be this, but because of the unity, all those types of things. There's a lot of things that can be worked through there, but I do think that is a healthy place, and that kind of brings us to my last two questions. I'm gonna ask them together because
Okay.
they're tied pretty closely. And the question is, what steps, first question is, what steps can the local church take to be more unified, so that we can maybe do some of these things that we're talking about? And then part two of that question is, not only what can the local church do, but what can the worldwide, corporate capital C church do to be more unified?
The local church, I think there's a combination of things that probably would be helpful. One is open communication and adherence to our core beliefs. What is most important? There's a quote that's gone around for years, but basically, in essentials, we want unity, and in our kind of secondary beliefs, it's okay to have some diversity. And so, nailing down what is most important, what's most valuable, what is unassailable as far as truth goes, and deciding, this is what we're going to stand on, I think is really important. From a worldwide perspective, that's important too. There's a call right now in some circles to go back to creedal Christianity, and what they mean by that is we have these ancient Christian creeds that have existed since probably the earliest one was, I want to say, mid 100s AD, maybe 200 AD, and then we have a couple others in the 300s, 400s. You have creeds that exist out there that express these universal beliefs, that Christians everywhere would have been able to, I agree to this, I believe this, I believe this, we believe this, we believe this. And so there could be a way through the creeds to return to something like that. We obviously at Ridgecrest aren't creedal in the sense that we repeat creeds. I did that at a church I grew up in. We would say the Apostles' Creed every single Sunday. And so there's a sense in which a return to something like that could be a way of us getting to a place of unity. I think confession of sin that may sound strange, but there's a binding effect when I confess sin to a brother or sister in Christ.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, like, I've entrusted myself to them. I've said to them something that is embarrassing for me, and I am in a lot of ways ashamed of, with the knowledge that they could use that to destroy me, but I don't think they're going to. In fact, I think they want to help me be accountable in this. They want to help me grow in this. And so if we could out loud confess sin to one another, confess communal sin to one another, individual sin to one another, there's something very binding to that as far as unity within the church.
Yeah.
There's another podcast that I'm listening to that was talking about this idea of gospel community, and one of the hosts was talking about an event that he did, and he said that I was worried it was going to be super awkward, but he said it was a men's event. He told the men, "I want you to turn to the person right next to you, and for the next few minutes, I want you to tell them the worst thing that you've ever done." And he was worried that nobody was going to do it, and everybody did. And he said it just transformed that group completely. That group became very unified purpose and meaning. And I think there's something really binding and healthy about confessing sin to one. It's obviously in Scripture for sure. So, and then just loads of grace and humility. We need to be okay with saying we don't know if we don't know. That's where your humility comes in. We need to be willing to give grace to people on issues that are secondary. And I do believe that there are some issues that are secondary that divide us denominationally, that we should be willing to overlook. And not overlook in the sense that we don't care. It's just that we're willing to give grace in that area and work with others. So I'll never. I was a part of a prayer meeting in North Carolina one time, and one of the guys that was leading the prayer meeting had mentioned a Presbyterian church and how that we should pray for that church, that the people there would hear the truth. And I grew up in a Presbyterian church that was conservative and preached the gospel and believed that the Bible was the sole authority for our lives as far as the truth of the Scriptures. And I heard that. I was like, that's such a wrong understanding of who those people are. And I went to him afterwards, and I was like, why are you calling them out? And he was like, well, they just believe things that are different than us. And I was like, yes, but they also believe a lot of things that we believe.
Right.
And I explained to him my background, and I was a Baptist for a reason. I mean, I believe in baptism by immersion. I believe in believer's baptism. But that doesn't mean that I can't look at my Presbyterian brother down the street and say, I can work with you. We can share the gospel together.
Yeah.
And so we need more of that, I think. I think we would be much more effective in the world for the kingdom if we could figure out how to work with each other.
Yeah.
So open communication, confession of sin, grace and humility. I think those are good ingredients for seeing the local church and the worldwide church be more unified.
Yeah, that sounds good. And as always, if you have any additional questions or want to dive in deeper into anything we discussed here, reach out to us. Give us a phone call, shoot us an email. We'd love to continue this conversation. If you have any other questions from the sermon that maybe we didn't cover, again, reach out. And again, a great opportunity, throughout the week to just continue these conversations, ask questions, dive deeper into God's Word. It's a great opportunity for us to do that, and each of us to learn and knowledge, but then more importantly, equip us to go out and share this with others. And so, as always, we appreciate you listening. We hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time.